You were never supposed to hear this. And if you walk away now, you can still pretend the world is what you thought it was. But once you know, you can't unsee it. This is the kind of truth that stains you. In the winter of 1847, 17 young women crossed the threshold of St. Margaret's Convent in the frozen hills of western Pennsylvania. By spring, 14 were dead, and the remaining 3, what was left of them, swore themselves to silence until the day they died. The church sealed the record. The official line was, "Nothing. No investigation, no explanation. Just absence." But what they buried wasn't just tragedy. It was a fracture in the facade of faith itself. And the reason you've never read about it in any respectable history is because the people who run your history made sure you wouldn't. I've held in my hands the surviving letters from one of those 3 women. The ink is faded, but the hand is steady. She was writing to a priest who never replied, at least not in words anyone could keep in an archive. And in those letters she admits something that will twist the way you think about the church, about devotion, about obedience. She said the deaths weren't accidents. She said they weren't suicides. And she said the women didn't die in the way you think of death. She said something older than the church itself lived in that convent. Something that wore the robes, spoke the prayers, and carried the crucifix. But it was not of God. It had been there long before the stone walls were raised. And it did not want brides of Christ. It wanted something else. What happened that winter wasn't an act of faith. It was a harvest. The ones who returned from those midnight summons were not the same women who left. You could see it in their eyes, in the way they moved, like their bodies still belonged to them, but the thing inside did not. And once you understand what they brought back into the world, you'll never again look at the veil, the habit, or the chapel the same way. If you're still listening, it means you're ready to step past the point of no return. You've seen the photographs. Black and white images of serene nuns with folded hands, faces soft in prayer. Forget those. St. Margaret's was never serene. Even on its best days it felt alert, like the walls were listening. The girls who entered that winter didn't walk into peace. They walked into a trap. The front gate was an iron arch painted with the words Pax Christi, Peace of Christ. But every hinge on that gate shrieked like something was warning them not to come in. They laughed nervously, telling each other it was just the cold. That's how the trap works. It gives you excuses. The convent was built in 1799 on the ruins of a Protestant mission that had burned under mysterious circumstances. The Catholics said they were reclaiming the ground for God. But I've read the missionary journals. They knew they'd built over something wrong. They wrote about night voices in the soil and lights under the earth. Their chapel floorboards warped in the shape of human faces until the night the mission burned. But the stone from those ruins was reused for St. Margaret's foundation. Imagine that. The church taking cursed bones and grinding them into the body of its own house. And then they wondered why the walls whispered back. The first night, the girls were made to sleep in the cold refectory instead of the dormitory. The Mother Superior claimed the dormitory wasn't ready. In truth, it was being prepared. Beds dragged into strange formations. Crosses turned upside down, then righted again. Chalk marks, symbols none of the girls recognized, drawn on the floor under each bed frame. One girl, Agnes Doyle, whispered that she had seen something moving in the rafters while they ate supper. Not a rat too tall. Thin arms. Watching. The others told her to hush. The Mother Superior didn't like to fear, she said. But Agnes was the first to vanish. It wasn't dramatic. No scream. No commotion. She was there when the candles were blown out, and gone when they were lit again for morning prayers. Her blanket was neatly folded. Her shoes were missing. The record says Agnes returned to her family for personal reasons. That's the line they fed to the rest of the world. But in the letters I've read, Agnes didn't leave. She was taken. And they saw her again, days later in the chapel. Standing perfectly still, eyes wide, lips moving to prayers no one else could hear. And that was before the snow turned red. You think silence is nothing. You think it's an absence. But there's more than one kind of silence, and the wrong kind doesn't let you rest. By the second morning, the new girls noticed it. At breakfast, Spoons scraped bowls, but no one spoke. Even the older nuns didn't exchange words. The air seemed to expect a conversation that never came, like an audience holding its breath before the curtain rises. And in that silence, the building made sounds. The slow tick of beams expanding. The faint shuffle of something moving in the walls. The drip of water where there were no pipes. Once, Margaret Kearney dropped her cup, and the noise of it rolling across the floor made several nuns flinch violently, as if sound itself could hurt them. Later that day, during their first hour in the chapel, the girls heard something strange. Under the chant, under the pipe organ, under the shuffle of habits on stone, there was a low, wet sound, like breathing, like the chapel itself had lungs. They learned quickly. In St. Margaret's, you either stayed quiet or something else would fill the silence for you. Incense has its own sweetness, its own smoke that clings to your clothes and hair. But the smell in St. Margaret's Chapel wasn't incense. It was thick, cloying, something sweet that had rotted and tried to sweeten again. The first time they knelt for prayer, Margaret gagged and had to hide it in her sleeve. The Mother Superior told her it was the old wood of the altar. But old wood doesn't smell like that. When the girls were alone, they whispered about it. Someone said it was a dead animal trapped under the floorboards. Someone else said it was flowers gone bad. But the letter I read, written years later, said she'd lifted the edge of the altar cloth one night and seen a dark stain in the stone beneath. Not blood, not wine, something thicker. Every Mass, the smell grew stronger, until one day, during the homily, one of the older nuns simply keeled over, unconscious. They carried her out without missing a word of prayer. The next morning, her place in the choir was filled by someone who looked like her, moved like her, but her eyes weren't hers. The official convent rules were written in Latin and read aloud once. Pray 7 times a day. Fast twice a week. Sleep in the dormitory unless sick. But the real rules were never written. You learned them by watching, by surviving. 1. Never speak in the corridor between Compline and Matins. 2. Never look into the vestry mirror after sunset. 3. Never, under any circumstance, answer a knock at your cell door in the dark. The girls didn't ask why. Questions earned punishments. But they noticed every story of a nun who went home began with someone breaking one of those 3 rules. And they noticed something else. Every time one of those rules was broken, the chapel bells rang in a pattern the church had no name for. It began one night when the bells rang at 2:13 a.m. No one was supposed to be awake but the watch sister. Yet the sound pulled everyone upright in their beds. The toll was heavy, like the bells were being rung from somewhere far deeper than the tower. The girls counted 13 chimes. Then silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere under the convent floor, the sound of more bells. So deep they could feel the vibration in their teeth. The next morning, no one mentioned it. But they saw dirt on the hems of 3 sisters' habits, as though they'd been walking underground. She had been in St. Margaret's longer than anyone could remember. Her hands were liver-spotted, her back bent, but her eyes, they were black. Not dark brown, black. No whites visible, no reflection. When she spoke, her voice was warm, reassuring. When she prayed, her lips moved in perfect Latin. But no one ever saw her eat. Margaret swore that, one night, she saw Sister Magdalene's eyes shine, not with light from the candles, but with something inside her, something like wet stone in moonlight. And she was always there, behind the Mother Superior, during every ritual, watching. It was the first time the girls were presented to the chapel. The full moon cast a pale glow through the high windows, and every candle was lit. They stood in 2 lines, hands folded, eyes down. The Mass was whispered instead of sung, the Latin words unfamiliar, the priest's voice lower than any human's should be. When it came time for the Eucharist, the bread was darker, thicker, almost meat-like. It burned on their tongues, leaving a copper taste. And then the priest, if that's what he was, placed his hand on each girl's head. Some flinched, some wept, and one smiled in a way no human should. That was the night the first snow turned pink in the courtyard. They found it in a storage chest beneath the laundry. The cover was eaten by damp, the ink blurred. but enough words survived to unsettle the reader. Sister Clare wrote in a looping hand, careful at first, then increasingly frantic. She wrote of prayers that didn't end with amen, but with a sound she could only spell as kathun. She wrote of being told to place her bare feet in the cold water of the chapel font during preparations. And she wrote of seeing the Mother Superior, not as an old woman, but as something shifting, in the reflection of the polished chalice. Her face was a skull crowned with black flowers. The last entry read, Asterisk, if the third night of the red moon falls on the feast day, do not drink, do not eat, do not breathe. Asterisk. No one knew what feast day she meant. The old stone chapel was built on older stones still. During a renovation, a section of floor in the north transept was removed, revealing steps. The workmen refused to go down. The smell was worse than the chapel's usual rot, so the nuns went instead carrying candles. Below was not a cellar but a network of passages, walls carved with shapes that predated Christianity. Some showed women in veils offering bowls to horned figures. Others showed shapes that looked like human but not. When the nuns returned, their candles burned lower than they should have for the time past. And one of them, Sister Agnes, was never quite the same again. It was found in the tunnels, fixed to a stone altar. It burned with a steady, colorless flame. Even when they covered it with a bell jar, the flame did not waver. The Mother Superior declared it holy. But when Margaret stood close, she swore she heard whispers. Not in Latin, but in a language that seemed to speak directly into her bones. One night, during the black hours, the candle's light flooded the entire dormitory, though it remained deep underground. That was the same night 3 girls woke with scratches on their feet, as though something had tried to drag them from their beds. Margaret overheard it by accident. The confessional was supposed to be private, but the grill was thin, and she was cleaning the chapel. The Mother Superior's voice was low, trembling. Not with fear, but with awe. Asterisk. I am not the shepherd. I am the keeper of the door. It was here before the first stone was laid, before the first prayer was spoken. I feed it. I keep it sleeping. Asterisk. The priest's voice, if it was a priest, was colder still. Asterisk. And when it wakes? Asterisk. Her answer, asterisk. Then the door will open, and the harvest will be taken. Asterisk. It happened during a storm. The lightning lit the cloisters and Margaret saw them, a line of figures and habits, moving silently toward the chapel. The veils covered everything, but there was no shape of nose or mouth beneath, just smoothness. The next day she tried to identify them. None of the sisters claimed to have been out of bed that night, and yet their shoes were muddy. She heard them during night prayers. 3 syllables, chanted softly under the Latin. Asterisk estura, canare, malith. Asterisk. When she asked Sister Rose what they meant, the nuns slapped her so hard her lip bled. Later, Rose came to her bed and whispered, asterisk. You can't unsay them once you know them. Asterisk. Margaret found those same names scratched into the stone under the altar, worn smooth by centuries of touch. Once a month, the girls were taken to a confessional unlike the others. Its wood was darker, slick to the touch, and the grill was made of twisted iron. When Margaret knelt, she expected to hear a voice. Instead, she heard breathing. Deep, wet breathing, and a slow scraping, like nails against the wood. When she left, her hands were trembling, and there was a small cut on her palm she didn't remember receiving. It came at the end of a midnight service. The wafer was black, crumbly, the wine thicker. The moment it touched her tongue, her throat seized. She swallowed, and it burned all the way down, leaving her lightheaded. For hours afterward, she could hear faint singing from beneath the floor. One girl vomited blood that night. In the morning, she was gone. Margaret found the letters by chance in the library inside a Bible too large to move. They were addressed to Sister Amabel, dead since 1824. Yet the most recent one was dated 2 months earlier. And worse, there was a reply. The handwriting was fine, spidery, the ink black as fresh pitch. It read, asterisk, the soil is thinning. Soon. Asterisk. The tunnels led to it, a stone well lined with carvings. The water was black, still. Margaret leaned close and heard whispers, not from above, but from within the water. Her reflection moved when she did not. Sister Magdalene caught her there and told her, asterisk, "It likes you, asterisk." The feast day was not on any calendar. The villagers were invited. The food was rich, heavy. At the center of the table was a roast animal no one could name. Too large for a lamb, too small for a deer, with flesh that bled black. The prayers that night were not to Christ. In a locked room, Margaret found rows of small figures. Children, perfectly formed, but made of wax. Some had teeth. Some were breathing faintly. The next day, the door was gone. During the black hours, the chapel filled with music. No one sat at the keys. The notes were discordant, ancient. The next morning, the air smelled of earth. Wet, freshly turned. She never left the convent. Her body was placed in the well. The water swallowed her whole without a splash. Weeks later, her voice was heard during prayers, answering in perfect Latin from beneath the floor. Old records showed there were always 9 sisters in residence. But Margaret counted only 8. The 9th appeared in her bed one night, lying beside her, face hidden by a veil. It whispered her name 3 times before vanishing. Came during a storm. Lightning lit the chapel, revealing a figure at the altar, veil fluttering without wind. When the veil lifted, there was no face, just a black, open space that pulled the light toward it. They tried to drive it back by ringing every bell at once. The sound cracked stone, shattered windows. The thing screamed, but not in any human pitch. The bells fell silent and melted. The convent went into lockdown. Doors barred, prayers constant. Something moved in the halls, scraping at the walls, the ceiling, the floor. One by one, the sisters disappeared. When the doors finally opened, only 3 remained. They were not the same. Their eyes were darker, their skin colder. One refused to speak. One refused to eat. One wrote in a language no one could read. The church sent investigators. They stayed one night. The next day, they declared there was nothing to report and ordered the building sealed. Within a year, maps no longer showed the village. The road was overgrown. The people moved, claiming they could not remember why. 50 years later, a new chapel was raised on the same ground. The same carvings appeared in the stone, without the mason's knowledge. One of the survivors left the convent. Wherever she went, crops failed. Children disappeared. The ground turned soft underfoot. Because I was there. Because the thing does not die. Because the door is opening again. You've heard it now. You've spoken the names in your head. You'll hear the bells soon, 13 chimes. Then the ones below. When they knock at your door in the dark, do not answer. But if you do, then it will be your turn to keep it sleeping.